Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today I'm going to be trying to answer a question that comes in a bit, and I'm going to try to answer it as a professional mastering engineer. You see that I'm wearing my black t-shirt today. This is my official audio guy t-shirt, so we're going to do audio nerdy stuff today. And that is talking about what kind of files should you send to your mastering engineer? Should they be a specific amount of loudness? Should you be hitting certain target levels on the files that you're sending to mastering engineers? Should you leave compressors on there? Should you leave limiters on there? What bit depth and resolution should you be sending to a mastering engineer? What are the final files you should be exporting upon mix to send to someone else who's going to work on them in a mastering context? We will give a complete answer to that today. And we're going to do it right after the briefest shout out to our sponsors, who include you. You sponsor this by smashing that like button and hitting subscribe and the notifications bell if you're on YouTube, or making sure you're subscribed to the audio-only version on Apple Music, Spotify, all that. Big thanks before we get into it to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative effects in the known universe. Steinberg, making excellent music software like Cubase, like the mastering platform Wavelab. And also big thanks to Focusrite. I'm speaking to a lovely Claret interface right now. Hasn't given me a lick of trouble. With that out of the way, let's get into the answers here. What audio levels should you be shooting for? That's the big one that I think most people are going to want an answer to. And I want to give you a complete answer, so I'm going to save that one for last because it's the most complex, so we can get the other ones out of the way super quick. All right, so easy question to answer, number one. What bit depth and resolution file type should you be sending to your mastering engineer? Whether you're mastering with me or anyone else, chances are they're going to want you to send a full resolution WAV file, not an MP3. And a WAV file, when I say full resolution, I really mean whatever bit depth and sample rate you were working at. So if your session was 2488.2, send me that. If your session was 2496, send me that. If your session was 1644.1, which it probably wasn't, send me that. More likely, if your session was 2441 or 2448, send me that. That way, any of the sample rate conversion, that kind of stuff is happening on my side. We're not doing an unnecessary number of changes kind of back and forth. It just keeps things simple. And also, in case you want to release in one of these higher resolution formats, I have those files to give you high-res masters from. Totally separate topic. I'm a little bit skeptical of high-res audio. I think there's very good reasons that I'm a little skeptical of it. And basically, the final format that most mastering engineers are going to give you is going to be a 1644.1 file. It's still really the standard in the world of audio. If you're doing mastered for iTunes or some high-res formats, it's not uncommon for a mastering engineer to also spit out higher-res versions, but most of the time I don't think that's necessary unless you're specifically releasing for one of these alternative high-res formats. Why I'm a bit skeptical of them, we can go into in greater detail someday, but 1644.1 is a compromise arrived at a long time ago, and for pretty good reason, for end consumer playback. But for me as a mastering engineer or anyone else working on your stuff, it's a good practice to send the highest resolution you have available. So if you worked at a higher bit depth and sample rate, send that. Okay, second question, really common question is, should I leave on my limiters, my compressors? What if I was doing bus treatment? What if I was EQing the bus? The short answer to that is leave on anything that's part of your mix. If you're mixing through a mix bus compressor that's part of your mix, leave it on. If you're mixing through an EQ on your mix bus, leave it on. If you're mixing even through a limiter, that is part of the sound of your mix and inform the choices you made, leave it on. If, however, after you spent 90% of your time mixing and for the last 5%, 10% of the time, you threw on a mix bus compressor and a limiter at the very end, an EQ at the very end, just to juice up the level and see how great you could get it to sound, in that context, I would say, leave it off, because what you're doing there is not this processing as part of your mixing. You were doing a separate mastering job to your stuff. It actually could be helpful to your mastering engineer if you sent them your attempt at mastering. So you give them something to beat. That's nice to have. And also you give them a sense for how far you were able to take it. And it's a good thing to be able to compare the work you could do on your own to the work of a professional mastering engineer. Hopefully the professional mastering engineer did much better than you could on your own. And if they did, you'll be able to hear what some of those differences are. And if they didn't, that's also good to know too. So long story short, If there are processors that you mixed through that were there for most of the time you're mixing, leave them on really, whatever they are. And if you added those processors at the end just to get things louder, just to try to do your own quick pass at mastering, take those things off. Although it's not the end of the world to send your own attempt at mastering to the mastering engineer for reference. Not necessary, but whenever people send me that, I pretty much always listen to it. And I always like to make sure that I did way better than they did. Okay, now we'll get into a little bit more of an esoteric thing, stems. Should I send stems? Me and most mastering engineers will probably charge more for mastering from stems than from a regular mix. There's more setup, and arguably when you're mastering from stems, you're really kind of mixing. So what I'd recommend most of the time is let's see how far we can get just by mastering from your mix. In case I'm moving too fast for anyone, mastering from stems, if you don't know what that is, you can send out stems of your mix. So a drum stem, all of your guitars in a guitar stem, all of your vocals in a vocal stem, a bass stem, that kind of thing, so that someone else can go in and do some final tweaking. I'm absolutely happy to master from stems for people. It does cost a little bit more because it's a more involved process. However, what I generally recommend, let's see how far you can get off of the mix, and let's see how awesome we can make it. And then if things need to be tweaked in the mix, my preference is to send it back to you, to have you make it even better. Because you're going to learn something that way. You're going to become a better mixer in the process than if I just do it for you. That said, if you want me to master from stems, happy to do it, but I wouldn't just send them unless you've had that conversation. All right, now we're going to get into the thing that most people are going to care about. How hot should my mixes be? Should I be shooting for certain target levels, certain levels of loudness? How loud is too loud? And I will give you my super technical answer to exactly the target levels you should be shooting for in your mixes. And that answer is negative. I don't care. I really don't. I really don't care what levels you send me files at anymore. I'll give you some caveats to this in a second. But a long, long time ago, it was a good idea to shoot for specific target levels on your mixes. Because if things were way too quiet, you would have had a lot of noise from all the analog processing out there. And if you were doing things way too hot, chances are you were getting some distortion, additional saturation the mastering engineer couldn't necessarily take back out. And when we were working on, totally analog formats, like mastering off of analog tape and then through an analog console, the level off of the tape might be so hot that A, it's saturating the tape, and B, it's driving everything in the mastering console harder than it should be, and the mastering engineer is first going to have to try to turn things down in a fairly neutral way before he even gets to mastering. I don't think that's that big of a deal anymore today in the age of digital masters, even for someone on a hybrid system. When I was mastering exclusively at Joe Lambert Mastering, where we had this beautiful, tens upon tens of thousands of dollars worth of gear in that studio, almost all analog process, going out of one set of converters through lovely analog outboard gear into another set of converters. Even then, if people gave me hot stuff, it's so easy just to turn it down coming out of the DAW, not hitting the converters too hard coming out, go through that system and back in. And then if you're working on an all digital system, it matters even less. The potential problem is if you're over compressing and over limiting things just to get them loud in a way that is hurting your end results. And I'll give you some overall guidelines, and these numbers will sound familiar to some of you if you listen to the podcast episode about whether you need alternate versions of your master for different formats. And here are those rough numbers. The final mastered version of your record, chances are it's going to be a little louder than -14 LUFS in most genres. There's some exceptions here in classical music and maybe some older school types of jazz recordings, but for most popular music, your final master is going to be louder than -14 LUFS. Just a quick recap, if this stuff goes out, if your release goes out on Spotify or it goes out on Apple Music or it goes out on YouTube, those streaming services are going to take the loudest tracks and turn them down a bit. And -14 is a number that happens to be used by Spotify and some others. Apple Music, I think it's a little lower, -16, but they're always around there somewhere. So basically stuff that's louder than that will just get turned down. However, much of the time, to get the kind of tone that people expect out of modern records, and to get the kind of dynamic consistency, and to get appropriate loudness out of the quietest sections of a track, your final master will probably be louder than -14. I'll circle back in just a second to what level you should mix at, but I want to give you a sense for the ranges of how loud things are going to be when they're being done with mastering. So for rock and a lot of pop stuff, the quietest that the final master would probably be would be something like -14. And the loudest it would probably be would maybe be -9. In this context, the smaller the number, the louder the track. So somewhere between -14 loudness units, -9 LUFS, somewhere in there is probably a good range for most pop and rock stuff. Some of them go louder than that, and there'll be some exceptions quieter, but that's a fairly good and big range. For electronic music, the loudest stuff, man, probably -8, -9 would be like the quietest it would be. And the very loudest, maybe like -5, -4. So rock records, maybe, and pop records, maybe -14 and -9. EDM, electronic records, maybe -9 or louder, all the way up to -5, -4, with a lot of them coming in -6, -7, -8, -5. And then hip hop, kind of somewhere in between, because hip hop often wants to be a little bit darker and fuller than the EDM stuff, and you can't always go as loud on the meters and retain as much of the kind of bottom you might want out of a hip hop record. So often those will be somewhere in between. Again, it's hard to give specific numbers, but anywhere from, sometimes hip hop records will come out super quiet around -14, -13, -12, but some of them might be screaming hot, almost like an electronic record at, -6, something like that. So I've given you some ranges. You probably want to send a master to your mix engineer on the quieter end of those ranges. Meaning if your final master is probably going to end up somewhere between -14 and -9, probably send the track not much louder than -14 or a little quieter than -14. If it is as quiet as -16, that's fine. If it's as quiet as -20, that's fine. You don't have to go that quiet. Other contexts in which you'd want to send a mix that's louder than -14. Yeah. If you think it sounds awesome. And that's it. That is it. If you are doing stuff that gets you additional loudness during the mix, that makes the mix sound both loud and awesome, and you're not pushing things just for loudness, but also for tone, also to make the thing sound as badass as possible, then bless you, go for it. If when you say -14, it sounds fine, but even when I level match, when I have this thing at -11 or -10 or -9, it just sounds more smoking, then do it. You have my blessing to do it. Some mastering engineers would give you different advice. They'd give you the textbook advice of, no, you are supposed to master more quietly and mix more quietly. So send me stuff that's quiet. And there's a vested interest that mastering engineers have in this, because if you send your stuff super quiet and they're the ones who make it stupid loud, they get to impress you with how great the master sounds compared to your original mix. But if you get really good and really sophisticated and really confident to the point where you're making things loud enough at the mix stage and the mastering engineer can't really wow you with extra loudness, that's okay. It means you're mixing well. And sometimes it's the mastering engineer's job to know when it's okay to do very little, because you already did a great job. And that's why I think experienced mastering engineers versus inexperienced ones offer the most benefit, is in not ruining things when they're already great. In addition to, when they're not as great as they could be, sometimes really wowing you and knowing when to do which. That's the big thing. All right, I hope this week's episode was useful for you. I hope this gives you a comprehensive understanding of it. Do you have different ideas, different opinions on this? I always want to hear about them. If you're on the YouTube version, make sure to hit the comments down below. I read every single one and respond when I can. Also, you can email me, podcast@sonicscoop.com. If you want to support the podcast because you really dig it, the best thing you can do is check out one of our full-length courses like Mastering Demystified, where I teach you everything I know about mastering, over at masteringdemystified.com. or Mixing Breakthroughs, where I give you a roadmap to mixing with more confidence, faster, and better than ever before. You can check that out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. If you want some free stuff, I've got a free mastering primer for you at Mastering 101. That's sonicscoop.com/mastering101. Or a mixing workshop, The 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers, over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. Big thanks again to this week's sponsors, which include you, by smashing the like button if you haven't already, subscribing and or giving us a 5-star rating and review on places like Apple Music and Spotify. That's always a big help. And a big shout out to this week's other sponsors, Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free over at soundtoys.com. Big shout out and thanks to Steinberg. They make a great mastering platform called Wavelab, also great DAWs for mixing like Cubase and Nuendo, and they have a great hardware interface line of their own. Speaking of interfaces, Focusrite, speaking into a great Focusrite interface right now, the Claret 2 Pre, hasn't given me a lick of trouble, sounds great, amazing bang for the buck stuff. Thanks to those guys. Thanks to you for hanging out with me. If you ever want to master records with me, I'm always happy to. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me once again. See you next time.